I would like to demonstrate for you a little simulation for my PIR sensor along with an LED. What we're going to do here is we're going to simulate some motion in front of the sensor, and when the motion changes, we'll have the sensor toggle the LED on and off. And we can see the LED has a little current limiting resistor going into pin 10. The sensor output goes into the digital input 2, and other than that, the only thing it needs is power in the center and ground, and it's outside. Let's take a look at how this simulates before we dive into the code. So I click on the sensor, and I can see the little simulation has created an object. Its location changes up in the lower right, upper right, and then what we'll do is we'll see that every time it moves, it lights up as red inside and then changes the state of the LED. So now it changes to red, and here we're going to change it back to off. So we're taking motion and we're using it as kind of a toggle flip-flop output. It's relatively simple to code. In fact, so simple I decided to make it more complicated, perhaps unnecessarily so. The entire PIR sensor system is now being handled as an interrupt, which externally drives pin 2. Let's take a look at the code on that. So what we've got, and this is kind of an interesting thing, we've got an attach interrupt command. So pin mode 10 is on output, that's for your LED. Attaching to interrupt 0, which is pin 2. LED change, which is the name of this method provided on the bottom. When things are falling on pin 2, it causes the interrupt, and then that causes an invocation of the LED change. The loop just runs inside of a 5-second delay. This is in microseconds. And 5 million microseconds is like 5 seconds. And then what we have for this Boolean is a little toggle. And when we come in, we invert the toggle Boolean from false to true, and then from true to false. And then if it's on, we emit a low, and if it's high, we emit a high. Actually, maybe we should say if it's off, we emit a low, and otherwise we emit a high. That would be good too. Or perhaps if it's not on, which is just like being off. So if it's not on, we emit low, and if it's on, then otherwise it's on, and then we emit high. You could make it more clear if you prefer by putting in little braces and use the else on this clause in here, and that ought to do it. Sometimes I think these indentations are not particularly useful. Other times I think they help with readability. I guess we'll put it like that. I don't know if that makes it more readable or not. Let's try it again. We'll hide the code, and doesn't really change the behavior much, I guess. But there it is. Now we can see the code again. And it is our first attempt to attach an interrupt. And that's kind of an interesting way to go. If you wanted to, you could do this without an interrupt. But I think that it's a very good idea to try it with an interrupt. It'll be your first interrupt, which is kind of cool. So this is going to be interrupt 0, comes in on pin 2. And when there's a falling edge from the PIR sensor, then it's going to run LED change, all asynchronously with respect to the main loop, which is kind of cool. Your first interrupt. Very practical example. Let's take a look now and see what happens if we do this without the interrupt. What we'll do is When there's motion, it makes the LED go on. So without the interrupt and without doing the toggle. Let's take a look at that code. That code's pretty easy to deal with. We'll use a read on pin 2. We're still going into pin 2. And we'll call that the button state. And if the button is high, we write out the high. Otherwise, we write out the low. In fact, in principle, you could just write the button state. You don't need all this if, then else stuff. Just write the button state directly. And that should work the same. Let's see. What happened to button state? There we go. Hide the code and run the program. That just takes the state and writes it right out to the LED. That makes things a little bit simpler, I think. And so now you just take button state and write it out. In fact, if you really wanted to do it, you could probably remove this line and paste it right in here. There's some refactoring there for you. And now it's a digital read of line 2, writes it directly out to the LED. And whenever it moves, light goes on, light goes off. Light goes on, light goes off. And there you have it, the PIR sensor. This was so simple, I almost had to put in the interrupts. So let's go back to the interrupt example. And take a look at that code again. This is not the interrupt example. This is the interrupt example. And there we go. So now we have LED change being invoked by the interrupt whenever there's a falling edge on pin 2. And that's how you do interrupts. Hope you like my little demo. Talk to you later. Bye.